Well, this is episode 142 of Give the People What They Want, brought to you from People's Dispatch. That's Zoe and Prashant. Prashant in a wonderful new kurta, bright and shiny, talking to us from what's it called now, Prashant? Bharat, India? Hard to say. I'm sure Prashant is
Not yet,
going
not yet.
to get to
Yes.
that. Not yet. Give the people what they want comes to you every single week. 142 episodes, eight more till we get to 150. So happy to be with you. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter, going directly to New Delhi, where the G20 countries are going to meet to discuss who knows what. Hard to say. There's been a BRICS summit, there's been NATO summits, and now there's the G20. Prashant, what's on the agenda for the G20 summit?
Right, a very, let's say, curious G20 summit coming up because while there are two angles to it, I think one we need to sort of focus on. One, of course, for India, this is a very prestigious G20 summit. They kind of took it this year so that it would match with the elections which are coming up in 2024. There's been a huge publicity campaign around that, trying to portray the summit itself has a major diplomatic achievement for the country, although it's actually just a regular scheduled meeting. So there's nothing super impressive about it. But that's been happening a lot. And but I think at the summit terms, what is actually going to happen away from all the the jazz and the kind of opening enthusiasm and all is actually what we're going to see is actually a very tense summit, which is basically because the fact that the Western countries and Russia and China have very substantial differences on various issues, but specifically on resolutions on the Ukraine war. Now, we have seen this. This is actually part of a trend. It's part of a trend in a number of international institutions, including the UN, of course. We have seen that wherever there's an opportunity, whatever be the forum, the West has not hesitated to sort of bring in references to the war and their perspective on the war as as essential to take business forward. And now what seems to be happening is G20 is also likely to fall into the same trap because it does look like there is no consensus on the final nature of the statement, which means that there will not be a heads of state statement, which really maybe dampen the enthusiasm as far as India is concerned. But I think sort of also goes to reflect the fact that now a lot of international diplomatic forums actually have pretty much become, in many cases, business has become difficult because the way in which this agenda is being pushed. Now, Russia specifically has said that, the G20 is a forum for economic cooperation. It's not a forum to discuss geopolitical issues. So they're like, we don't want this issue to take over this forum. But as far as the United States and the West are concerned, every forum is an opportunity for that. And that is likely to probably, it seems, as latest reports indicate that it's very uncertain there is going to be a common statement at this, which also I think takes us to the larger question, and the larger question being the fact that the G20 itself is in a bit of an existential crisis. Now we know that the G20 was created, or at least it gained strength after the global economic crisis of 2008, and it was sort of promised as the Western countries expanding the club, so to speak, so that more economies, more countries from the global south would be part of the elite group, so to speak. But what has happened, especially over the past few years, is that the US has accelerated its focus on the G7. The G7 has really become the more important bloc for them, which means that the G20 is kind of, on the one hand, the powers of the global south where the G20 are having probably less of a say. And on the other hand, now we have organizations like BRICS emerging, which has really become the most dominant, it has become the most attractive option for many countries. We saw the huge number of countries which wanted to take part which wanted to be part of the bloc in the last summit. Many of these leaders actually attended the meeting. There was an expansion with 6 countries being added in, and BRICS in many ways is being now seen as one of the say 3 or 4 drivers which might take engagement, global engagement, in the future. And the G20 itself seems increasingly a bit irrelevant at this point of time. So this is the context in which this G20 summit is being held now. Big question is, like I said, whether a summit will come. There are of course a lot of other issues as well. There's climate change, there's global debt, all of these issues again, where the West has a very different perspective from the vast majority of countries. And in many of these discussions, it's unlikely that we're going to see any major breakthrough. Although, for instance, on the question of debt or interest payments, or on the question of climate change, there is definitely a need for urgent action. But it does not look like G20 is going to be the place.
Almost as if, Prashant, the G20 has become BRICS plus G7, a kind of reconciliation body for these two large groupings to get together and perhaps have their issues thrashed out. But we'll see, isn't it? This is the first G20 summit since the BRICS expansion. So let's see how that turns out. Well, this is, of course, the weekend coming into Monday of the 50th anniversary of the coup d'etat in Chile, the country at the south of South America, where 50 years ago, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of September, the reactionary sections of the Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, moved against the democratically elected Popular Unity government of President Salvador Allende. Allende was killed in the Moneda, the presidential palace. Subsequently, the military set up a coup regime, killing thousands of people, exiling many more, trying to eviscerate the left. About 10 days ago, the leader of the Communist Party of Chile, Guillermo Tellier, died. He died 10 days before the 50th anniversary of the coup. People like Guillermo Tellier, Gladys Marine, and others picking up the mantle in the ruins of that dictatorship, fought very hard for 17 years to establish democracy in the country again. A very long period of military dictatorship in Chile, 17 years, not as long as in Brazil, where the coup lasted for 21 years. Nonetheless, in Chile, the military dictatorship imported a team of technocrats, many of them trained at the University of Chicago, known as the Chicago Boys. They came in and set up a laboratory for neoliberalism. What had been a laboratory for socialism became a laboratory for neoliberalism. The country really hasn't fully recovered from those 17 years of the coup, despite the fact that it has now been 33 years since the re-establishment of democracy, twice the length of the coup. The impact of that coup has been great on this country. Even now, a 50-year anniversary, and yet the right wing, especially online, have been ferocious in defending the coup, saying that Allende should not be celebrated, that there shouldn't be any, discussion, positive discussion of Mr. Allende's period. In fact, current President Gabriel Boric has been trying to create a pact with all political parties to say that democracy siempre, there must always be democracy, that they would not, come together ever again to allow for a coup. And the right wing has rejected Mr. Boric's plea. Now, imagine this is merely a plea for no military intervention, no extra democratic intervention into the country, and the right has said we are not interested. It's a fascinating conjuncture. At the same time, right wing newspapers have been attacking the Communist Party, which is the largest plank of the left in the country, an important constituent of Mr. Boric's government. What they are trying to do is to create a rift between the communist left and the center left, Frente Amplio of Mr. Boric and other factions. Trying to create that rift, they feel that they can destroy this government and then the right can rule for several election cycles. The coup, in other words, 50 years ago has not really dissipated from life, public life. The debates continue around the nature of whether a left agenda is possible in a country such as Chile, where a center left to center government is now in power, having a really hard time moving an agenda. It's not that they are not able to move an agenda. It appears sometimes that Mr. Boric's government is a government of tactics without a strategy. And the communist left playing a very important role trying to advance some form of strategy for the government. Let's see what happens. Monday, the 11th of September, there will be a celebration, a commemoration of that coup across the country. There will be marches, there will be demonstrations. But again, it's not that 100% of the population will be behind the commemoration in the way in which it will be held by the left forces in particular. Large sections will be there cheering on the Pinochet era, including former presidential candidate Mr. Cast, who likely will run again. And if indeed the right is, has the advantage of splitting the left, might return and come to power. A dangerous time in a country like Chile, but nonetheless a somber time, a time to reflect on how horrible that military coup period had been for this country and the depth of cultural change that it's affected. In a sense, that was 1973. 3 years later, there was a coup in Argentina. A junta comes to power, equally repellent. Zoe, in Argentina today, similar themes. What's happening in that country?
Well, it's interesting that at the same time that the people of Chile are disputing the narrative around the coup, where we see right wing coming out of the woodwork to say that this was a good move and that these human rights violations didn't happen. A similar process is happening right now in Argentina, but it's specifically linked to this electoral conjuncture. As we know, Argentina is in the middle of a very, very new and interesting electoral conjuncture where we see for the first time since democracy was restored in Argentina, the Peronista forces came in third in the PASO elections, the primary elections, and a new political force, a libertarian far-right fascist force led by Javier Milei, came in first in these primary elections. His vice presidential candidate, Victoria Villarruel, on Monday held an activity in the legislature of Buenos Aires in honor of the victims of communism. She's referring to the victims of the armed groups that existed in the 70s, the ERP and the Montoneros. And in this sort of move, and this is action that they organized, it was an attempt to sort of say, and she said it outrightly, that the 30,000 detained and disappeared, this is a false statistic, and that the real victims in this situation are those that were killed by the armed left militant groups, and that it was not a situation of genocide as it has been characterized not only by people on the left in Argentina, but international human rights organizations. I mean, what happened during the dictatorship, I think, is indisputable, yet it is being disputed by the right wing. So on Monday, she organized this activity to say that we must recognize the real victims, that the left in their discourse is ridiculous, that renowned human rights organizations like the Abuelas and the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo are crooks, and that all of what they do in the search for justice and search of their children is just a political stunt. I mean, these accusations, while they might seem ridiculous, it's truly something that's terrifying, because these are organizations that for decades have been fighting for the truth about their family members who are disappeared, who have risked their lives for decades in the search for justice. And organizations did not stay quiet in reaction to this event being organized. They were out on the streets mobilizing, rejecting this negationist event that was happening. And many said that this is clearly a stunt. This is a political stunt to raise the profile of the campaign. They're trying to further polarize Argentine society, which we know that in these elections are extremely polarized. I mean, the fact that a candidate like Milei, who says he's going to dollarize the economy, who says that he's going to dissolve the central bank, who says that he's going to cut all ties with China, with Brazil, with any other left-leaning government. I mean, the fact that he was getting 30% in these primaries is an indication of just how polarized and how fragile Argentine society is right now. And the fact that they're trying to polarize, for example, on and weaponize this very, very sensitive and fresh wound, which is the wound of the dictatorship, the 30,000 people who were detained and disappeared. and trying to say that this is not true, this did not happen, is just another indication of these sort of politics that this sector is willing to do, to take control and to implement their policies, which are in the end against the people of Argentina, which are not going to better the lives of these people who are, of the 40% of the people who are suffering in poverty right now. It is clear that if Javier Milei says he's going to put in more austerity measures, this is only going to further put these people in a more difficult place. So a very, very concerning development. The struggle for truth, the struggle for history, the struggle for memory is a live one. It's an active one. It is not. It is clearly not. This discourse is not something that we've won over. That's been cemented, and so this continues to be an issue. Maybe we didn't think it would happen because of how solidified, how proved it is. But again, we're in the 2023 when truth cannot be taken for granted.
Quite right. I mean, truth cannot be taken for granted. We have three candidates in the Argentinian race: Sergio Massa, in a sense, representing the Peronist center. We've got Patricia Bullrich representing the right, and then we have Javier Milei representing the far right. Truth is an odd duck, Zoe, because Patricia Bullrich used to be a Montenegro. She was an armed left-wing guerrilla who went into exile in Brazil after the coup, returns, is a Peronist deputy for many years, and now has completely negated her background. In fact, denies being a member of the Monteneros, an armed group that was fighting for revolution in Argentina. The journeys people take and then the lies they tell about their past. You're with give the people what they want, what you want. It seems, for us at least, is the truth about what's happening around the world. Zoe, Prashant, and I try our best to give it to you. We come to you every Friday. We're at show 142, show 150 on the horizon. Don't forget to send us your selfies. We live for those. We're going to go back to Zoe now because there has been an internal election in the Morena ranks to have a presidential candidate put forward. Lots of interesting news in Mexico, including about abortion. Zoe, I hope you're going to give us a full package about what's happening in this important country in the world, which may join the BRICS next year. What's happening in Mexico?
Well, Mexico is definitely one of the most important economies, especially in the Americas, a large industrial power. And again, yes, as you said, two very important developments. Yesterday, the courts ruled that the penalization of abortion is illegal, essentially decriminalizing abortion across the country on a federal level. In Mexico, as in many countries in the Americas specifically, there were laws criminalizing people who both carried out abortions or both themselves or those who aided them. So doctors, institutions, etc. This ruling has essentially made that illegal, that no one can be criminalized for having an abortion. This is huge news, especially as social rights across the continent are under attack. It's not, again, as we're seeing this rising right in many countries of the continent, it is these social rights, these rights won by the feminist movements in the streets, the LGBTQ movements on the streets that have fought for so long to win these basic rights. These are the rights that are really under attack, of course, in addition to the rights of the working class, the labor rights that trade unions have been fighting for. So this is an important victory, giving kind of a legal basis and really giving, that legal backbone to people to being able to access this fundamental public healthcare right. And another important victory for women as well is the election of Claudia Sheinbaum to be the presidential candidate of Morena. As you said, it was an internal consultation that took place within the party, months of meetings, of consultations. There was the formulation of the plan for the homeland. This was made in conjunction with communities and the base of Morena across the country. What is the future that the people of Mexico want? How do they want to continue the fourth transformation, which is a process that was undertaken by Andrés Manuel López Obrador starting in 2018 when he was elected president? The fourth transformation, of course, is taking further this plan of transforming Mexico, of making it a more equal and dignified place for the people. Claudia Sheinbaum is now the coordinator of the fourth transformation, being the presidential candidate of the party. She was facing off against 5 other people, including former Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard, who objected to this process in the last couple of days before the results were announced. He had started making allegations that the process was fraudulent, despite it having been conceived of and the methodology being constructed between the teams of all the 6 candidates. They decided which pollsters were going to be used, how exactly this consultation would take place. And at the final hour, Marcelo Ebrard, seeing the general polling showing that he would not take this first place, perhaps that kind of pushed him to take this negationist accusation of fraud stance. And now he has pulled out of Morena and said that it's possible that he might run for president, not with Morena. He said there's no space left for Morena. So we'll definitely be following that development. Andres Manuel, in his Mañanera press conference, said that he hopes that Ebrard will return to Morena and support the unity of the party, as all of the other candidates have already expressed their support and put their confidence behind Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the presidential candidate for Morena, already polling ahead of Xochitl Galvez, who is the candidate of the far right unity of PRI and PAN, the parties that ruled over Mexico for decades without stopping. So it's going to be an interesting race. 2 women facing off, very, very different plans, very different projects for the country. We'll be following it, of course, at People's Dispatch.
It's important, Zoe, to point out that regardless of who wins, whether it's Senator Galvez, who is coming from, as you said, PAN, PRI, and PRD, it seems, she is facing off against Claudia Sheinbaum of Morena. Whatever happens in the election, Mexico will have its first female president ever since it became a republic. I think that's a pretty significant thing, even though, of course, both women have very different political views, as you rightly said. And nonetheless, looks like Mexico will have a female president before the United States. Another interesting little snub south of the Rio Grande toward the north. Um, Prashant, we're going to move to Africa. We're going to do the last 2 stories of our show today on Africa, on the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then on Gabon. DRC, of course, especially in its eastern flank, has seen a lot of violence in Kivu and so on. Tanupriya Singh at People's Dispatch has a very good report out on some violence that's taken place there. Prashant, what's happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
Right. I mean, earlier this week we saw protests in the province you were talking about, North Kivu as well, because after what was a massacre that took place on the 30th of August. So I think estimates say that some 56 people were killed by armed forces of the DRC, their own army, basically, killing these people ahead of what was considered what was going to be a protest over a very significant issue. And I think it kind of resonates with many say what is happening in many of the countries right now. So this had to do with the presence of UN and East African community forces in in the region. Now, why are these forces here? These forces are here because the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been affected by insurgency from this group called M23. Now, M23 has a long history. We have done shows on this before as well. But basically, it is pretty much acknowledged at this point that the M23 group is supported by Rwanda and President Paul Kagame. And, this group, it's very clear that it is being armed and supported by Rwanda, and it has wreaked havoc in the DRC, taking a number of towns. And it is basically to control this and to implement various ceasefires. There is a peacekeeping force, the UN peacekeeping force called MONUSCO, and the East African Community Force are both there. Now, let's look at the UN Security Force first. MONUSCO and its previous force together, like our report says, it comprises the longest, most expensive UN human peacekeeping operation in any country in the world. But what have they achieved is really the question a lot of people are asking, because there's been no real improvement in the security condition. In fact, there have been even killings attributed to the MONUSCO force itself. And now there's a huge debate over whether this force should even be there in the country. In fact, the DRC's government itself has said that this peacekeeping force should leave. The peacekeeping force has also indicated that by December, when there's an election in the country, they leave as well. Similarly, the East African Community forces were deployed more recently with a very similar aim, but again, the way they function, the so-called defensive approach they've taken to the violations of the ceasefire, all these have really, made the people of the DRC very, very angry. And of course, also important to consider the fact that the EAC, the grouping which sent these forces, has Rwanda and Uganda, two countries which are responsible for millions of deaths in the DRC. So it's natural that the people are asking that these countries which are responsible for these millions of deaths, Rwanda, which is openly backing the M23, is the country deciding on what forces to send to counter the M23. So this absurd situation that is there is what has, is the larger issue at hand. And people try to speak out. There was a massacre, but there's been a lot of unhappiness on this in the DRC. Now, another force is again set to come to the DRC, which is the SADC, the Southern African Communities Forces. Now, what role they will play, whether they'll sort of have a different role, is actually a very important question. Remains to be seen. But I think important to sort of end with this aspect of the various UN and peacekeeping forces, which really often fail to do their job. Last week we talked about Haiti, which is another example of a peacekeeping force which has actually, in fact, caused a lot of havoc. So, the issue of security itself, again, playing out in other countries in Africa, and how do you counter these? These are actually very important debates in the entire continent. Right?
And then let's go from the DRC in some few minutes we have to Gabon, where there was a coup. It's the eighth coup actually in the past 3 years on the African continent, following the coups most recently in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This coup has been interesting because it sort of followed the pattern of Niger with one exception. The pattern is thus: the military came in, overthrew what was supposed to look like a democracy, although Gabon is slightly different from the situation in Niger in the sense that the Bongo family had ruled there for 42 years, resembling more the situation in Haiti, where both Papa Doc Duvalier and then Baby Doc were in power for almost 5 decades. Very similar to the Gabon story. Nonetheless, the coup in Gabon took place. Military officer General Oligui took power and very quickly brought in Raymond Dong Sima as the prime minister. Now, Mr. Sima is an interesting person because he had been in the government of Mr. Bongo in 2012, 2014. He had, in fact, run for office for the presidency against Mr. Bongo and was the leader of the opposition. Very similarly, and this is the similarity with Niger, the military in Niger brought in Ali Lame Zain into office. Mr. Ali Lame Zain had been a minister of economy in the previous government. These are experienced, in a sense, mainstream politicians in their countries that have now come in with the military to form a military civilian government. It's odd to call them a military coup because the military did initiate the coup, but without elections has turned over the reins of administration to various figures of the opposition. And in this case, Mr. Oligui has promised elections, although no time frame. Once again, Gabon has been expelled from the Central African Economic Community, just as ECOWAS, the Economic Commission of West Africa, expelled Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. The difference between Gabon and in Niger is, in fact, the anti-French sentiment in Gabon is not very strong. Mr. Oligui has also said that he is open to talking to all parties. I think it's an error to judge this to be just the same as the coup d'etat in Niger. This is a coup against a 42-year-old effective dictatorship that has leached the country of its wealth. And here, let's see what happens with Mr. Raymond Sima as Prime Minister, a mainstream politician, not given to wild rhetoric one way or the other. It's an open question where Gabon will go. But Again, a great interest to us. We're following it closely, not trying to be premature in our judgment, watching, waiting, trying to bring you the most credible news possible, both at People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, which together brings you Give the People What They Want, brought to you every Friday, and also as a podcast, show number 142, over and out.